Okay, well, welcome everybody to the second Historic Districts Coalition training session. The first session was about the Certificate of Appropriateness review process, and this one is more in depth regarding the historic and design review process. So this is a series of trainings, and so you can see here, these are the topics of upcoming sessions. We're on session number 2, the HDRC. In 3 weeks, we'll discuss design guidelines and policy documents. Oh, Paul, you hijacked me. Give me 1 second. Okay, I think we're back. So this session will cover these 5 questions. What is the HDRC? Who is eligible to serve? What does the review process look like generally? What happens after action by the HDRC is taken? And then what does public participation look like? And we'll mostly speak to what it looks like now in the virtual hearing process, but we can also discuss in-person meetings once those resume. So overall, the HDRC serves in an advisory capacity to city staff. The code specifically mentions city directors and the city manager. A recommendation for approval of a certificate of appropriateness is a recommendation to the city manager. Our office, the Historic Preservation Officer, Shannon Miller, our director, is the designee of the city manager, and we issue the certificates of appropriateness on behalf of the HDRC. Decisions are routinely upheld. And so there is that caveat that allows deviation from the recommendations of the HDRC. It's really not our policy to deviate from what the HDRC has recommended. So it is our policy that we routinely uphold the decisions of the HDRC. This is a little different than what most people think. So there are other boards that are quasi-judicial, which means that they sort of act like a jury and make legal decisions and interpretations. So the HDRC is not that, but we kind of act like it is. We act like all decisions are final, and we don't really stray away from those recommendations. The roles of the HDRC are defined in the Unified Development Code. These are a few of them, probably about half, but these are the main points that we wanted to notify you of. They are in charge of recommending the eligibility of new historic districts and landmarks, reviewing all certificate of appropriateness applications. Certificates of appropriateness are required for new construction, alterations, demolition of a landmark, and those type of undertakings. Reviews and recommendations for updates to the design guidelines and relevant code amendments. As you all are familiar with, last year was supposed to be our UDC update year. And so we had already started working with commissioners on incoming amendments. And ultimately, they would have been the recommending body for all of our amendments moving forward to the UDC adoption process. They also make recommendations to other relevant boards and commissions for projects impacting historic resources. Usually, we are doing that on their behalf if it is not a project that by code requires HDRC review prior to the other board and commission. But very often, if there's a zoning case that's been to HDRC prior to, or a Board of Adjustment case that has been to HDRC prior to, we do provide the staff report that is the summary of the HDRC's recommendations. And then they also recommend ad valorem tax relief, which is our historic tax certification program. This was a slide from our previous session, but just as a reminder, a COA, Certificate of Appropriateness, is required for projects in our 32 local historic districts, local landmarks, the 7 river improvement overlay districts, downtown zoning, and public projects. Generally, anything that's new construction is going to be going to the HDRC if it's one of these design districts. So kind of back to the schedule, everyone's familiar with this. The HDRC holds public meetings on the 1st and 3rd Wednesdays of every month. We usually only have 1 hearing in January, so that results in about 23 hearings a year. But we do add special hearings as needed, depending on caseload, or if we have certain cases that we know are going to take a lot of time from the schedule. They also have the ability to form subcommittees. We currently have 2 that are acting, our design review committee, the DRC, you'll hear that referred to quite often. And then less often referred to as our demolition and designations committee. Anytime we have a demolition case that is likely to result in the designation process or a recommendation by the HDRC, we do engage that committee. It's usually a site visit. Lately, we've been doing virtual site visits where staff goes and creates a video and provides the information to commissioners, and then we have a video conference discussion about the application for demolition. The membership is 11. There. The membership is 11. That is because City Council and the mayor all appoint a member to the commission. So we have 10 City Council districts and 1 mayor. That adds up to 11. A minimum gathering of 6 members constitutes a quorum. And so we always make sure that we have at least 6 in order to conduct business at a hearing. Sometimes we need more if there's recusals on a case, and we'll discuss recusals in a little bit. For most certificate of appropriateness requests, so new construction, alterations to a building additions, that requires just a simple majority of those present at the hearing to approve the request in order for the case to be recommended. For applications requiring demolition of a landmark, there's a 2/3 majority voting requirement of those present. And then newer, there's a 3/4 majority of total membership required to approve a landmark designation. And we'll have more about the landmark designation process at session 4. I did see we had a question come through. Let me open that up. One moment. Okay, from Barbara. If either director or city manager changes the recommendation, what is the policy to notify proponents and opponents? In the past, this has been these have been high profile cases and generally very public. And so there's usually a memo that comes out for the city manager's office. So yeah, there is public notice when that happens. It's very rare, like I said. It's only happened 3 times in the past 12 years. So, and that's out of thousands of HDRC cases. Literally, we hear about 600 to 700 cases a year. So what is the process for attending design review committees? So let's talk about the subcommittees a little bit. And I'm sorry, I didn't anticipate going into depth about this, so I don't have a slide. The design review committee is not a full acting quorum of the commission. So there's not 6 members at those meetings. And so we don't have to meet the public posted agenda requirements for a hearing. But those are regular hearings. They do meet on the off weeks of HDRC. So it's the 2nd and 4th weeks of the month when those meetings are held during the workday. We are meeting right now by video conference. And I think actually we're going to continue to do that long after the pandemic, just because it is more convenient for our commissioners to attend. Those are public meetings. Anybody can attend, but it's also not a public forum. And so we want to be very clear that if there is public comment on cases, those really should be reserved for the full hearings where there is, a record and public forum for those cases. So the process for attending is generally we provide the information upon request. And so we do have every now and then citizens that are interested in attending meetings, and so we provide the information at that time. We do not post agendas for those meetings just because we are usually packing in the schedule. We're doing 5 or 6 cases within a 2-hour span. And so each case is getting 20 to 30 minutes with the commissioners, and there just isn't time to go through all the logistics of adding people. Who makes up the DRC and how are they chosen and scheduled for DRC meetings? From Monica. So our rules of procedure of the HDRC allows the chair to make committee appointments. In the past, because we've had 2 committees, we used to split it down the middle. So we would have 6 members on one and then 6 on the other, with the chair being shared between both committees. Because the schedule has been very full for the past several years, and because our commissioners just don't have time to attend that many meetings, we have made all of the committees sort of at will. Everybody is eligible to serve on both, just depending on their schedule. And so we, at a minimum, are always able to get 2 or 3 commissioners, but we currently don't have specific committee appointments, but those are done by the chair every year or so. Monica asked, the memo goes only to the formally active parties, media releases info to others. Yeah, I mean, again, everybody, all of our information is public. And so generally, we're describing one instance that happened a few years ago, but it's probably going to be a little bit different every time it happens, just depending on the case.
Yeah, I just want to jump into Barbara's question. It's by that time it all goes to the city manager's office. That's who's responsible for communicating, right? For
city staff is. I mean, yeah,
it's not you guys.
Yeah, I mean the decision would be coming down from the city manager's office, but obviously we work closely with them to disseminate the information, and we obviously inform our commissioners of the action as well. Hopefully before they see it in the news.
Okay, I'm sorry. Is this about my question about the change of decision by either the director or manager?
Yes.
I don't know. I have a concern about that because, of course, if you have a dog in the whatever they call that, you're going to keep up with it. But I just wonder if, and it's only happened 3 times, so I guess we don't need to elaborate on it. But I just wondered if there was a process. Well, thank you.
I mean, the process is a decision is made. There's usually a memo that's issued internally. Usually who is copied are commissioners, the applicant, and then it's usually very public in the media. And by usually, I mean the last time it happened. That has been the case for the past 2 times. It was handled similarly. So that's generally the policy.
Corey, I'm not clear, like for the design review committees, is it ever, I know sometimes we're notified when you're having these reviews and other times we're not. Is there a way like the neighborhood association can be notified when these occur?
Yeah, I mean, we can. We don't have a policy for that now. I really, really want to emphasize the fact that there's not a lot of time for discourse at those meetings. It's really just to give the commissioners a briefing on what's coming in so that there's less time spent at the full hearing going into some of those details. They have a better understanding of the project.
I have another question about DRC. I noticed on some of the DRC reports in the case files that we have participants there who are not part of the commission, the HDRC commission, but are rather just various other folks who are also not the applicant or the neighborhood association. Is the inclusion of those other individuals at the discretion of the HDRC chair? Or how do they get there?
Yes, the rules of procedure do allow for, I mean, the word is citizen membership, but obviously, everyone's a citizen, but non-commissioner membership. And so we routinely have a representative from Centro. They have reached out to the city and requested to be able to participate, especially for projects that are downtown. And so they do participate in those. We also have a former commissioner who just likes to stay engaged, Daniel Lazarine, who used to be the District 2 commissioner. And he does attend as well from time to time. However, they don't contribute to the quorum for commissioners for those meetings. So we need 2 commissioners for a quorum at those committee meetings. And so, having the central representative plus the chair isn't enough. We really look for commissioners to be the ones providing the input at those meetings.
So Corey, Centro said they wanted to be at design review committees. So are they notified every time there's a design review committee or just when it's in their area?
It's on their calendar. I mean, it's a regular meeting schedule. So there's always a hold. And then prior to those meetings, we send out the agenda.
Huh. Thank you.
So if they're on the regular calendar, anybody that wants to go could put it on their calendar and then check and see if there's an actual meeting being held that particular day?
Yes. I mean, we have to be careful with it. I mean, we do not mean to keep people from those meetings whatsoever, but that meeting is not the public hearing, and it's not the best forum for public discussion.
Well, isn't it true that, Corey, that really, if you're attending, you only the staff and the proponent can?
That's what we
and the
recommend.
commissioner.
Obviously, we
I'm sorry.
can't. Like, I'm never going to mute you because you're talking in a meeting. Like, we're going to allow it if people have questions or want to be engaged. But that's where it gets difficult. Is we can't police those meetings the way that you probably think we can. It's so we really just want to make sure. If a public meeting needs to happen, then that can still happen separately from the DRC. But we want to make sure that the time of the DRC is effective for the commissioners.
I guess the reason I'm asking all these questions, one, I've attended lots of them, of course, but it's usually because, it's a case and that I'm interested in, and pretty much a historic district. Yeah. But at the same time, so many times the proponents will say, well, at DRC, you all said this. Our commissioner will say, well, at the, they'll say who attended, and whoever attended will say, well, this is what we figured out. So they do, even though they're maybe informational, there still seems to be a lot of emphasis at times in certain cases put on those meetings. That's why I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important step for complicated projects because when they get to the full hearing and it's complicated, then generally they won't take action. And so the full commission is leaning on those members that attended the DRC to kind of bring everyone up to speed and brief everyone on the things that they looked at. And things that have been addressed by the applicant in their application. Those meetings are really just to provide comment. No decisions are made. And if you ask the applicants that attend the DRC, there's really a lot of complaints because they are looking to get some sort of inclination of what will happen at the hearing, and it just doesn't always happen. And usually you're meeting with 2 or 3 commissioners that have their own opinions, and then you get to the full hearing and there's other opinions, and everybody's opinion is equally valid on the commission. And so yeah, there is frustration from the applicant side, and it's really important that we define what the DRC is for our applicants in advance. When an application is scheduled, we send them a fact sheet about what to expect, what to bring, and what comments mean when you get comments from the commissioners. You have the opportunity to address comments in advance of the hearing, but that is not an indication of what's going to happen at the public hearing. Scott asked if a commissioner can attend, can he or she send a replacement of their choice? That's not really a mechanism we have right now. We do plan in the future as part of our UDC amendments to introduce alternates to the commission. Really, we're introducing a second board with the ability of that membership to serve as alternates. So that's something that we want to do. But again, if somebody who is not appointed to the HDRC is attending, then they can't count towards the quorum. And so there technically isn't a DRC unless we have that minimum of 2 members constituting the quorum. What we can do is, I'm going to take a note that this needs to be discussed in more depth at our add-on session 5. And we'll spend more time on that. Okay, so who can serve? We get this question all the time. Who are these people and why do they get to make decisions about my project? So like I said, all members are appointed by the city council and the mayor. They each get 1. The UDC does provide some general qualification guidance. So there's different type of experience that is recommended, and this is coming from the THC, the Texas Historical Commission's recommendations. So architects, preservation historians, landscape architects, archaeologists, public art experts, and then also just business owners and people involved in the community are also eligible to serve. But at the end of the day, City Council is able to waive requirements of the code, and really whoever is appointed and approved by City Council is eligible to serve. They must reside in the city of San Antonio. The terms generally follow city council term limits, which is 2 years. But there are provisions for holdover in the case that a new member is not appointed if a city council member is outgoing. And so once you're on until you're reappointed, essentially, until your council person appoints a different person in your position. We do have election of officers. There's a chair and a vice chair are the 2 positions. That happens in January of every year, and so we'll be doing that at our next meeting. They must have a minimum of 1 year of service on the commission in order to hold that office. Our current chair is Jeff Fetzer, who has quite a bit of experience on the commission, as well as Scott Carpenter, our vice chair. Conflicts of interest, this comes up a lot. I mentioned recusals earlier. The code does state that members must recuse when they hold substantial interest, and that is the phrase used in the code in a case. Typically, that's going to be if there's business or implications, or if the applicant has an association with a family member. So those are the instances where we always recommend that our commissioners recuse. It is up to them to determine if they do hold a substantial interest in a case, and there's a form that they fill out every time that they do recuse, and so we're able to document that. When they do recuse, they are not able to take action on the case. They are also not able to participate in the discussion, and during in-person meetings, we would actually have them leave the room. Virtually, we just have them mute and turn off their video, so it's like they're not there. Questions on who is eligible to serve on the commission? Okay, let's keep going. So as a reminder, this was a short little chart that was shown in the last session. We received an application, we immediately do the completeness review. And then there's kind of 2 paths that an application can go for approval. Either it's approved by staff or it's scheduled for HDRC review. Another way to think of this is everything's going to the HDRC unless after our review we've determined it's eligible for administrative approval. In the past, there's been, I think, confusion that it's kind of 2 different processes, but really it's the same process. Administrative approval is just an option for certain applications if it meets the UDC requirements. Generally, it's a 2-week review period for staff. Application deadlines are posted on our website. It's generally a Friday. And then 2 weeks after that, we're posting the agenda. In the past, historically, we have almost always been able to keep up with our application caseload. And so if you submit by the application deadline, then you're pretty much scheduled to be heard on the next available HDRC. We've got a little bit of a backlog right now, so we haven't been able to do that a few times this year, actually, during the pandemic, just because of the length of the meetings. There is a 10-day completeness review period for all applications that happens prior to the start of that clock. But essentially, the clock is running once we take in an application, unless after that completeness review, we've said it's incomplete and requested additional information. And then more on the next slide, action is required by the HDRC for all applications within 60 days. And this is very important. Right now, as part of the City Council emergency orders, those requirements in the code are suspended until further notice. So we're not subject to the 60 days right now, but we are actually doing that in process and making sure that we're providing a timely review. So that 60-day clock is always ticking once we've accepted an application. This was on the last session, but it bears repeating. What can stop the clock is when we determine it's incomplete and we're working with the applicant to receive additional materials to complete the application. Sometimes we receive a formal request in writing by the applicant to postpone or schedule for a specific hearing date. So if they say, okay, I'm in the queue, but I don't want to go until March, then however many days between now and March, that date, we will add to the 60-day timeline. So they can extend it at their request. The applicant can withdraw the application at any time, and a new application would be required in order to start over again. And then, of course, if there's action on the item to approve or deny, then that 60-day period is no longer relevant. The clock will keep going regardless of whether or not it's been heard by the HDRC, they have to take action. Resetting the case, postponing, continuing to another hearing, setting for subcommittee, those aren't actions. And so the clock keeps running while the case is being rescheduled or considered at the subcommittee level. If we mess up, if the posting language is not sufficient, or if we miss a notice requirement, then we need to reschedule it, but that doesn't stop the clock. And so staff is very mindful of those type of technical issues. Inactivity from the applicant. Sometimes we will receive an application, it's complete, it's scheduled for hearing, and then we never hear from this person again. We've got one right now that we're dealing with. And so at some point, we do need to push an action from the commission on that application if the clock is about to run out, because at the end of that 60 days, the code states that the application is automatically approved unless the commission takes action to deny. And so that sort of puts the pressure on us and on the commission to make sure that we're taking reasonable action within the designated amount of time. We have a question from Joe. If you have time, can you address why NCD is overseen by DSD and historic? Let's add that to the 5th session. NCDs versus historic. And then also signage from OHP has not been timely or picked up if postponed. Yeah, so you probably have all seen the red HDRC signs as part of our notice requirement. Actually, let's talk about it here. So the red signs are usually posted the day before or the day of when the agenda is posted on a Friday. This is a requirement in the code to provide physical notice on the property impacted by an HDRC application. And so it has the affected address, it has a description of the project, and has all of the meeting information and contact information if you like to participate or have questions for the case manager. So those are logistically very difficult. We've made some improvements over the past year, probably 3 years at this point, where they have those plastic sleeves, so we're able to quickly interchange them and reuse the signs. When we were having in-person meetings, part of our workflow is having the applicant bring the sign with them to the meeting. And that was very effective. It was saving us a lot of time because it takes a full day to go and drop 40 to 50 signs on properties. So we're not always able to get them right away, but we're usually picking them up on the same day we're putting them out. So they will usually sit out for an extra 2 weeks following a hearing. Sometimes if a hearing is rescheduled or continued, the sign can stay and we'll just update it with information, with the hearing date information. So the sign will stay, we'll just replace the information that's in the plastic sleeve. Are there repercussions for applicants to remove the signs from the property soon after installation? Yes, they might not be heard because we're not meeting the notice requirement anymore. So that is an issue. The problem is it's really hard to document if and when that happens. We hear it sometimes that the sign is not there, but it's hard to tell when that happened. So as long as the code requires us to provide 72 hours advance notice. And so if we've done that, then generally there's not an issue with no longer meeting the notice requirement. But that's absolutely a concern if it can be documented that it was not publicly available for a long amount of time. Quick overview of the life of an HDRC application. So applications come in, again, that starts a 60-day clock unless we've reviewed it for completeness and said it's not complete. All potential cases, so we look at them. Generally, we're going to know pretty soon by looking at it if it might be eligible for administrative approval. We have a weekly meeting with our design review team where really we have daily meetings all the time with the question about administrative approval. We have a weekly meeting where we discuss cases that are coming for HDRC and whether or not they're complete. Those are added to a tracking sheet and assigned to case managers, and so we track them that way. Case managers then take the information, they follow our SOP and the UDC. A little bit of this was on the last session about how we communicate with applicants. And so we very immediately do an email to applicants letting them know that we've received it, it's reviewed, it's potentially scheduled for HDRC on this date, and if we have any questions, that way they know who to reach out to regarding the hearing. Those items are scheduled for a hearing. We put the agenda together, and again, action is required within 60 days. Following action, staff issues the COA by email. And actually now with the map feature that we talked about at the last meeting, we can actually just say either navigate to your property or here's the link to your certificate. So during that really kind of 10-day period, the commissioners are preparing the staff recommendation. And so there's a template that's generated by our portal for the case. We go in and we add the applicable citations. We do a review and write the findings and recommendation. Those are finalized with myself and with our director, Historic Preservation Officer, Shannon Miller, usually the Wednesday before the Friday. And so there's not a lot of time so really our case managers have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 6 business days to write the reports for all of their cases. And sometimes it requires site visits. Sometimes we're waiting for the design review committee to incorporate those comments. And so I want to iterate to everybody, it is a very, very quick timeline for these cases. Those recommendations are finalized. The agenda is drafted. The exhibit files are prepared for public posting. The exhibits are the staff recommendation plus anything received for the application by the deadline. So there's usually one file that has all of that information. Again, as I mentioned, the UDC requires us to post the information, the agenda, and the notice requirements need to be met 72 hours prior to the hearing. Because our hearings are on Wednesdays, unless we want to come in and do it on a Sunday by 1 p.m. Or by 3 p.m., we do that on Friday afternoons. So prior to posting, so during that 10-day review period, we're in constant communication with the applicants, and they may select to modify the proposal based on the feedback. It's our policy to give early feedback as soon as we identify that something's going to be an issue. We let them know. There's no use in going through the full process and posting a case that they're not going to be happy with the recommendation, especially if it's something that they were willing to fix. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's talk about this, and then I'll go to revision of exhibits. Barbara asks, how do opponents find out about modifications after posting? Yeah, we're going to get there. Yes, Scott, it is the same timeline for minor and major projects. A lot of times we will tell an applicant with a very complicated project, look, like we're not ready. But we do our best. Like it really hasn't been an issue that we haven't been able to meet our normal schedule with a case. But yes, that's what's sometimes extreme about this job is where each case manager is managing 10 to 15 cases, and some of them might be multifamily or new construction cases that just require more time. When we were working with our UDC task force last summer, this was one of the issues that we really looked at, and we clocked how much time is spent on cases depending on the type of request it is, and it's really an exponential time difference for new construction. So right now we don't have a different timeline for those larger cases, but it is something that we are potentially looking to change in the future or change our policy. But right now the code has 60 days for everything. So we we got to move on those cases. Barbara asks, how do opponents have input as HDRC negotiates with the applicant? Okay, let's get there a little bit. So the agenda is broken into 2 sections. Consent items, staff is either recommending approval or stipulations that the applicant has agreed to. So essentially, there's no need for the applicant to address the commission regarding staff's recommendation. We're in agreement. Now, obviously, the commission has the right to pull any cases for individual consideration if there's questions or disagreement with the recommendation, or if based on the public comment, something is brought to the attention of the commission that bears additional discussion. There is definite misconception about what the consent agenda is intended for. a lot of people view it as minor projects versus major projects. So like Scott says, the fence versus multifamily, but that is not the policy. The policy is where there's agreement with staff's recommendation or agreement to meet stipulations, it's going to stay on consent unless the commission pulls it. Individual items are where the applicant wishes to contest staff's recommendation. So they either were not recommending approval or there's stipulations that they don't agree to. Because the timeline is so quick, a lot of times, we finalize those recommendations on a Wednesday and then we're preparing to post on a Friday. So that gives us 2 days to kind of work with the applicant and figure out if they're going to be on consent or not, if they agree, if they can meet the stipulations, if they want to contest stipulations. We are usually communicating by email because it's best to have everything in writing. And so sometimes we just don't have an answer by the time we're posting. So you will see us, we will sometimes pull things from consent for individual where the applicant has finally gotten back to us after we posted and it needs to be heard individually. We also end up sometimes having things on individual where they say, you know what, I do agree after all. We don't move things back to consent. We will hear those cases individually, but we'll make it clear that that we don't need to have a lot of discussion about that case because the applicant is in agreement with the recommendation. Okay, let's go do this slide and then let's get into questions. So like I said, prior to posting, the applicants may modify the proposal. This is intentional because design cases are complicated. And so just depending on the scope of the project, like a fence is one thing, new construction is another. And so depending on what the modifications are, it may require additional review time. It may also change the recommendation. And so just depending on what they're seeking to do, we can negotiate with them somewhat. The reason that we want to have the ability to do this is because we want to give applicants the opportunity to respond and better prepare for the hearing. Obviously, if there's motivation to meet a stipulation and continue on the same timeline, that's good. Like we want to steer people towards meeting the guidelines and meeting staff stipulations. And so that's sort of an incentive is if you can show it, then you're more likely to be approved at the hearing or more likely to be on the consent agenda, which is really valuable to people. We will provide a deadline based on the complexity of the revisions. And so sometimes if we have a new construction case and they say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and change this building and change the site plan, we'll say, okay, great. You need to meet the next application deadline or you're going to get kicked down the road. But if it's something minor, like, oh yeah, I'll change the detail on this material specification. And that is something that we can say, okay, as long as you have it to us by Thursday so we can include it in the recommendation, then we can include it in with what is posted. Barbara's making a face. We'll get there, Barbara. If the changes are substantial or not in response to staff's feedback, then we can delay the case. A change doesn't mean it's positive or negative. And so obviously we're looking for positive changes that are meeting the guidelines and meeting staff's input or recommendations from the design review committee. If something is changing in the reverse direction, is not going the direction it needs to, then obviously that can result in a delay in the case. Okay, let me go back up here to the questions. How do opponents have input as HDRC negotiates with applicants during the HDRC meeting? Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. That is a problem that we've always had, even in in-person meetings. And so skipping ahead to the participation section, we have citizens to be heard. And so you show up to the meeting, you sign in to speak on a case, and generally that is happening before the commissioners are discussing. So generally we used to have it first, but our rules of procedure actually say that we have the applicant present, the citizens to be heard happens, and then the applicant gets time for rebuttal, and then discussion happens. And so it is possible that commissioners are asking, hey, what about this? That's something that I can support in a stipulation, this type of change. But yes, you're right. Unless they call on somebody who signed in to speak to come back and provide additional witness to that, then there's not really a chance to speak up. Obviously, in the in-person meetings, you've all been to ones where people raise up their hand and just shout. And so sometimes that happens. And I think our commissioners are very good about making sure that concerns in the room are addressed in the room. It's a little trickier at the virtual hearing because everything is provided up front, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. But Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's a concern. I will also say that lately it seems like a lot of things that require revisions based on discussion at the hearing are not getting action. They're going back to DRC first, or they're being continued to the next hearing. That's not always the case, but that's very often the case, and especially the case where there's concern from the community that's been documented. What is the term for citizens input versus applicant besides opponent? Barbara, why don't you unmute and explain that question?
Well, the thing is,
Oh, you just remuted. Let me.
so we have the term applicant and we have the term and applicant, you know, I don't like using the word necessarily opponent for neighborhoods and historic districts that are trying to help a project fit into their what they consider their quality of life guidelines, or whatever you want to call that. And so I was just wondering if anybody has come up with any other term besides opponent, because we have applicant and we have proponent, and now I see we're using applicant, which I think is much better. But I just can't. I just wonder if there's another term, because sometimes these attorneys that come, they get into the legal part of it, but you know, we're using applicant, not proponent and opponent. And I was just wondering if you'd seen any other term that could be used. I don't like using opponent all the time because I'm not always opposed to the whole thing, but just wondering if there's any other term that could be.
We always have and will use the term applicant for, you know, whoever is representing the application or the property owner. They're generally the applicant. It's tricky. Like we want to quickly give our commissioners a summary of the public input, and so sometimes we have support and sometimes we have opposition, and we want to make that clear. Like if we've had 5 letters in support and 3 in opposition, like we want that to be clear to them, like that it's split. So you'll see, like when we do the case list that gets shown on the screen at the virtual hearings, like if we have comments in opposition, we'll say that. Sometimes it's not always black and white. Sometimes they're just comments or generally supportive of the project, but with like tweaks or conditions. And so we won't say support or oppose then, we'll just say we have comments. But I do feel like we're tasked to provide them a summary of the public comments so that they understand just at a glance what the direction of the comments is.
Okay.
But I agree, like nobody wants it to be a negative process. Very often it is. And so there's no reason to pit groups against each other, especially against the applicant, if it's really just input, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gemma asked, why aren't all the recommendations put into the stipulations? They usually are. Gemma, do you want to unmute and speak to that? Monica also agrees. So, I mean, generally, if we have specific recommendations and stipulations, those are listed as bullet points in the recommendation.
Yeah, and that's what I thought it would be. But, you know, our 335 trail, I'll see some of the recommendations I totally agree with, and I think they're going to be moved down to a stipulation. So I've seen that done a number of times, and I use that one as the example because that's fresh in my memory. But they'll even recommend that, you know, buildings be 2-story, say in the section. But when you look in the stipulations, they don't recommend it. If you go back and you look at that, there really is a discord between the two. And that's just one right now that I remember. There was a number and I thought, yes, they made these recommendations. I look in the stipulations and they're not there. And when the applicant looks at this, they usually never read the recommendations. They go right to the stipulations.
Yeah, so a little bit, I wish I had done a screenshot. So there are findings that is staff's evaluation of the project against the guidelines or whatever the applicable section of code are. And then those usually, any type of stipulation that is listed in the recommendation, we say which findings it relates to. So all of the recommendations are based on a finding. This is really how we build the record. It makes the ultimate action more defensible. Gemma,
but they're not there. I'll see the findings, and then as it moves down, some of the findings are so important, and then they're not at the end when our recommendations or stipulations to the applicant. So I like the findings. Most of the time, I think they're quite appropriate, but I don't see them always carried forward.
They're still part of the record. Generally, they do become stipulations. And so I feel like we're talking about an error that happened at some point, like an isolated specific case. I do not agree that this is a widespread issue. Like generally, if there are stipulations or if there are issues identified in the findings, then those result in stipulations.
That's general. So that usually occurs. Okay.
Yeah. Stakeholder community, stakeholders, yeah. Those are all terms that could be used to address the opponent's concern. Barbara says, since we're not supposed to contact commissioners, how do we say we have a designated person who we agree can negotiate to the group opposing a case? Why don't you just unmute and re-ask that?
I referred back to my comment about what happens at HDRC after citizen participation or input, the presentation of the case, and then the negotiations that seem to happen during the meetings.
Okay.
Like where there's, we usually have a person that if you have a case that warrants this kind of effort, who we as a group knows what the level is of the group, I guess is what I'm referring to. And so when it comes up, we can't, since we're not supposed, the thing is that I thought there's a rule you're not supposed to deal with HDRC commissioners, right? Yeah, it's the law. And so how can you let them call on you?
I don't think it's against the law, but so we do discourage ex parte communication, so off the record communication. So if you see Commissioner Fetzer at the grocery store, like it's fine to say hello, but we discourage. We tell them at their training not to let people bend their ear too much outside of the public record. Like we want to keep those discussions at the hearing, which is most appropriate. I think everyone can agree with that. And it's really what they're comfortable with. So, no, it's not illegal, but we do encourage that things stay on the record. Now, at the hearing, I know what you're saying. Like very often there's a large group representing either opposition or concern. And so if they have questions, the question is, who speaks on behalf of that group? I think that's fine we've had in the past where somebody has presented themselves as the representative for that group, and generally that person is called upon. It's really just kind of how the discussion goes at the hearing. I think sometimes it's pretty clear like who should be called on for additional questions. It just doesn't always happen.
So do you think that it would be a good idea for people who are in these groups that come to say to the commissioner that represents their district, if there are any questions, if anything, or I don't know how you would say it yet, but this would be the person I would suggest you call on.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, especially.
I don't think we've ever done that. Done that kind of we've tried everything. We got everybody's email and all that, but you're not, since you're not supposed to do it. But I just wondered if that's the way, it would be one of the ways to do it, because I think groups get down there and either want to protest and riot, or they just don't know what to do, so that's why I was asking that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I really think it just, I'm phrasing my responses into how in-person meetings typically went. It's a little different, and we'll talk about, with the virtual hearings, it's everything, all the comments are provided in advance, unless you call in. We have had some where we've had the caller on the line and there were additional questions for the person that spoke on the call. So let's get in that later.
Okay, because I think that, I mean, even if it's online, I think that, like, I would say if I was, you know, of course, if I'm reading it versus I've read it before, I don't know. I'm just thinking where we could put that in, but I think it's really important because things can change during an HDRC meeting about a project. You know, commissioners can come up with ideas, you know, and then the applicant will say, "Oh, okay, that sounds good to me." When, you know, that's something that, you know, we're the group that's been invested in it, the historic district or neighborhood was like, "Oh no, wait a minute, you don't understand. There's this thing next door or something," you know. So maybe that's the way to do it, is just to start tagging that onto what you either write or say, even on online virtual meetings. You know, I hadn't thought about that. I've just, you know. Anyway,
Yeah.
thanks.
Monica asks, I was told after the case and recommendations are made public, access and earful to a commissioner is fine. Is that accurate? I mean, no, it's really no different. If you have comments, we highly recommend that those are made formally at the hearing. And again, it's really, I mean, there's nothing to stop you from doing that, but we do encourage our commissioners to not engage too much. And it's really what they're comfortable with. Like, you know, if the discussion is going in a place where they don't have a good comfort level, going into that level of detail off the record, then we encourage them just to wait. So this has come up a lot. So we talked about working with the applicant to revise an application prior to posting. So that's one thing. The other thing that happens is we'll post on the Friday. The applicant thinks about it over the weekend and then says, you know what, I want to update my application so that I for sure get the action I'm looking for on Wednesday at the hearing. So right now with virtual hearings, we don't allow any updates to the exhibits. We don't show anything other than what was posted publicly. And that is because we're asking all of you to provide the comments in advance of the hearing so that we can prepare. And in-person meetings, it was a little different because you could come to the meeting and if something was shown that was new, you could all see it and have the chance to comment on it. Now, it's still an issue because if you have prepared comments and you're seeing something new, then you're no longer as prepared as you would be. And so this is something that we are looking to address in either policy or UDC amendments or something. It does make sense that if somebody is wanting to just make sure that they're meeting the stipulations and say, look, here's my updated drawing that meets it, and they're hoping to get the action for approval with that drawing on Wednesday, that makes sense. Like, we want to encourage somebody updating the application to meet stipulations and giving the commissioners a chance to review it before an action is made. What doesn't make sense if the request is revised, like obviously we can't allow it to be revised to a point where the posting language and notification that was given is no longer accurate or consistent with the level of scope for what is currently requested at the hearing, or they can't exceed the scope of the public notice. And then our policy is also, we don't update our recommendations either. So if somebody comes in with changes on a Tuesday or sometimes day of the hearing, you will see commissioners ask all the time, has staff reviewed this? And we will say, no, not really. Like, we haven't updated our recommendation. We can sometimes say, like, this obviously is in response to a stipulation and is closer than what was before, but we don't formally update our recommendation. And generally that gives the commissioners some pause. Like, they're not always comfortable taking action unless we've really sat down and looked at it. So it's really at the risk of the applicant if they want to do that. But very often, especially for new construction, they do want to try to do that. They don't want if there is a stipulation, they don't want a decision about whether or not the project meets that stipulations to delay their case further to another hearing. And so very often they seek to bring that updated design to the hearing to make sure that they get an action on that date. Does that make sense? Okay. Generally, items are reviewed this is in the context of a historic property. We do have historic design guidelines, as you all are familiar with. And then as mentioned at the last session, we also have sections of the UDC that provide development standards. Those typically are applicable in our Rio districts or our downtown districts. There's development standards like building height and setback that are hard numbers that must be met. The guidelines are a little more flexible. So there's a lot of language that says should, or generally, or average, or median, and things like that. And so there's room for interpretation by the commission. But this is a section of code that kind of gives the commission that authority to make a decision. It says applicants should be approved if in general conformance with the guidelines, but if that denial of the application may be based on any inconsistency or nonconformance with the approved guidelines. The other thing to note is sometimes, because all historic properties are different, there might be a guideline that just doesn't make sense for that property. And so, there might be 7 applicable guidelines for a case, and maybe it's hitting 6 out of 7, and that's good enough based on the conditions of that property or whatever. But in other cases, depending on the property, that 7th one that wasn't met might be a really important one. And so that could be the basis for denial. And so there really is flexibility for a commission, and I think that's important. One of the issues with that is if we only had standards, that would probably put us in a bind with the Board of Adjustment. So you could imagine typically if there's a standard that cannot be met, the remedy is for a variance approved by the Board of Adjustment. And we didn't want to be in a position where all of our historic cases are going to the BOA, where the BOA isn't really the appropriate authority on those cases. The HDRC is. And so this flexibility does give the HDRC sort of more power in the decision making. The reason I said here, some applicable guidelines may not be as impactful as others, given the project or the property. Gives the HDRC greater authority over the cases impacting historic properties. And then also, depending on the district. So there's variations between historic properties, but there's also variation oftentimes between our districts. And so what's appropriate in Monte Vista may not be appropriate in Lavaca Historic District. And so it does allow for unique interpretations depending on those districts. And then, as most of you are familiar with, there is an option for individual historic districts to introduce more specific guidelines for their district so that we can more consistently apply guidelines depending on the district it's in. So following the review, these are the options that the HDRC has. They can approve it as submitted. They can approve it with stipulations. Sometimes they approve with staff stipulations. Sometimes they remove some of staff stipulations. Sometimes they add them, but that's all documented in the action. The project can be denied, and very often for complex projects, we're breaking a overall request down into different items, and so it is possible that 2 out of 3 items could be approved and 1 could be denied, and that is also reflected in the action. It can be referred to subcommittee, continue to reset. And again, those 2 options do not do anything to the 60-day review period. The clock keeps ticking if those actions occur. Or it could be withdrawn. And again, if it's withdrawn, then the applicant is voided, the application is voided, and a new application would be required in order to pick up the case again. So if it's approved, staff issues the COA within 10 days. We are usually exceeding that limit. We're usually doing it before the 10 days is up by email, but that gives us time to review the record if there's questions about what the action was, or if there's a really highly specific stipulation we want to make sure we get right in the record, then that gives us time to do that. Anything else that is not approved as submitted is likely to receive a commission action letter unless the stipulations have already been met in the application. So you don't get a COA and if you have stipulations unless you have updated your drawings to reflect that you've met the stipulations. It's not enough just to agree. We have to make sure that the documentation reflects that. And so you will get a commission action letter that cannot be used to pull permits. It's not the same as a COA. It's just a record of the action by the commission. You'll receive that for a denial. You'll receive that for a continuance. And then once you have documented that stipulations have been met in the application, then we can convert your letter into a certificate. And we'll usually include a note saying applicant submitted drawings on this date that reflect stipulations, A, B, or C, and then we'll issue the COA. Okay, so that was a long section. Any questions about anything we talked about with review process?
Corey? Of course, I have a question. One of your slides prompted a really important question that I have. And I know the yes or no answer to this, but the question is to prompt a little bit more discussion. Are our individual district commissioners encouraged, required to make site visits or drive the area to learn more about where a case is located? Yes, important flexibility slide is the one that's relevant to this. So if we have an HDRC that is allowed to be flexible in their decision making, if that district individual is not familiar with it, with the area and the nuances and the direction of the neighborhood, how useful of a tool is that flexibility? I've seen it with some of the commissioners. Okay, I'll be perfectly blunt. Our commissioner does not speak up as often as we would like, but the other ones will regarding cases in our district. And if they're not familiar, that flexibility can sometimes not reflect the best direction for a case or for the block face, etc. So that's a concern.
I mean, it's certainly encouraged. We don't require it. I do usually receive questions from almost all commissioners just during the course of that few days before a hearing about cases. So they're definitely looking at them. You will see at hearings very often we pull up Google Street View if they haven't had a chance to do a site visit, and that sometimes can help with context. But I don't really have a solution to the issue you're stating. Obviously, we want our commissioners to make an informed decision, and so a lot of times you will see us interject sometimes, like if there's clearly misinformation or lack of understanding about the context of a site or something in the request, like we will make it clear very often during the meeting.
Because I think in the discussion at HDRC, after the applicant has brought their project and after you've had public comment, I think that conversation with HDRC could be either more direct, more expedited, more definitive if commissioners really knew more specifically what they were looking at, rather than just taking somebody's comments, letters, and the plan as the evidence. But
yeah, well,
so
I think
yes,
that
it's very tricky.
I think that also speaks to the importance of district-specific guidelines. I mean, I know it's a tall order for a lot of neighborhoods, and a lot of them are lacking. But it's really potentially an opportunity to say, like, here is a adopted document that says this is the context of our neighborhood, this is the development pattern, this is what is most appropriate for us, and that would have public input, and that would really kind of set a really good touchstone for decision making in the future for those neighborhoods.
I like that answer.
But I mean, we can't just produce them. Like we really, that's a big undertaking. Barbara and Gemma are working in River Road to do it, and they've been working for years at this point to kind of get started, and it's a lot.
Yeah.
Sometimes
generally speaking, that is a good solution to that, the flexibility tool.
Yeah. Barbara asked if there's field trips. No, there's not. There's just not time. But very often our commissioners do, like if they're looking at a case and they feel like they need to go look at it, they do. Site visits sometimes do happen at the DRC. You can see that Sometimes cases are referred at the hearing to a DRC site visit specifically because they need to see something there. And so that's kind of done on a case-by-case basis. Are spot inspections ever conducted to ensure stipulations are being met? That's done by staff. I mean, and really that's any case. So regardless of if there's stipulations or not, everybody is going to have to do the scope that was approved. And so if there's a report or something that comes to us that is after permitting happens, that is not consistent, then we'll inspect and we'll follow up. But that's why it's important that we are documenting stipulations in the design documentation at the permit level. And there was a lot on that in the previous session because that's the record. Your drawing of what you're going to do is the record. It's not verbal. And so that's why we do that, and we're able to enforce any violations with that following permitting. Barbara's asking if a store district can set up a field trip for commissioners. What's tricky about that is the quorum issue. I mean, but potentially, yes, like it could be something that is part of a DRC schedule or something to where it's a regular time and we're not going to have 6 or more. It could also be something we do during a training. So we do have annual training. We did it virtually this past year. Honestly, there's just not a lot of time. Our commissioners are already, I should have said this at the beginning, they're volunteers for one. Most of them do have full-time jobs. And so they are taking time from their jobs to volunteer for the city. Usually it's 8 to 10 hours a month for the hearings, and then an additional 4 to 10 hours at subcommittee meetings on top of that a month. So it is a large time commitment for them. And so we try not to add as much as we can, but obviously there is sometimes necessity to add to that schedule. Alex says many applications are after the fact. Yes. The requested work has already been done without needed permits. If a COA is denied, is the applicant ordered to remove the offending improvement? If so, how much time is given and is it monitored? Generally, yes. So the code gives us direction for that. If there's a violation, either work without a COA or in violation with the approved COA, then it has to be remedied. So one remedy is you put it back how it was. And most often that's what people do. If it's not remedied, then we are able to take steps forward for compliance, which is usually a municipal court case, which is usually something that takes a long time and it's not that effective. And so we definitely work with people to come into compliance outside of the court system when possible. We have a lot of success doing that usually. And we are usually flexible on time because of that. If somebody has to reconstruct something, then that's going to take more time than, oh, I just need to remove this section of fence or make this fence shorter. And so we are able administratively to kind of negotiate those terms. We do have a form that we use, a compliance agreement form that we worked with the city attorney's office on just this past year, actually, where it's basically a contract with the property owner, where we say these are the terms that you need to meet in order to remain in compliance or to remain or to demonstrate that there's a good faith effort to come into compliance and remedy the situation. And if those terms are violated, then we move forward with the court case. So that's been a really useful document, and we've had a lot of success that way. But that doesn't solve the problem of how much work is being done without approval. That's an ongoing problem. It has been, and it's something we certainly try to be as proactive about as possible. But at the end of the day, I can't stop somebody from going to Home Depot and doing something in the house. We can only follow up after it's been done. I mean, potentially, yes, we could facilitate transportation for a field trip. But it's hard enough to, if we have a training that's all of them, we have to post an agenda. It's a quorum. And so what you're talking about is a mobile hearing. So, I mean, there's probably a solution. Like we can think about it, but I agree. Like it is good for them to be familiar with the different neighborhoods and sort of the individual uniqueness of each one. How long is the time between the hearing and the official minutes? I mean, lately we've been having the minutes to be approved on the following hearings agenda. So it's about 2 weeks. Those are posted on our website. And then I'm going to show you guys here, like, if you can't wait until that, you can always go and watch the recording, and it's really easy to access. And you're going to get a lot more information from watching that recording than you would ever get from minutes. So I'll show you that link in a little bit. Barbara says it'll be fun. Maybe it can be one of those those mobile bars that everyone pedals at. Like they sit and they pedal.
My problem is that there is this delay between, quite often in the hearing. It is really unclear what the decision was.
Delay in the audio, like in the video itself?
In the hearing, after all the discussion, the commissioner makes a motion, and quite often it gets amended and unamended, and there are often quite a few changes to the motions.
Okay. In those cases, feel free to reach out to staff immediately. We do not let them move forward unless it's clear to us. And you will see we will sometimes have them restate the motion if it's not clear to us.
Well, okay, it's
so, and that'll always be in the minutes. You'll have to obviously wait until those are posted. But if you want it sooner, then just feel free to ask us because we have it.
There's a lot of work that can be done in 2 weeks on a building. And the neighborhood, if we don't have clear minutes that show exactly what the decision was, we don't know whether or not the work is okay. We don't.
Yeah, I mean, they're generally not getting their certificate again until 10 business days later. It's not immediate. They can sometimes request it and we can work on it, but we're not obligated to give them a COA right after the hearing. And generally permits come later anyways. So it is rare that somebody would start work right after hearing. I know they're probably excited sometimes and feel like they have approval, but we do tell them do not start work until you have your permits and the certificate. And you know they have to post that certificate as well. But again, like just like reporting a potential violation, like we're very accessible that way. So if you have a question about something you're seeing or about what the motion was, feel free to reach out to staff. And I feel like we're pretty good about responding. Same day, usually. Okay, so following action by the HDRC is we issue the COA or the commission action letter. And then in the first session, we talked about the permitting and plan review process that also follows, usually. The applicant can move forward. I'm sorry, I've got a box in the way, so I don't know what this says. As approved, so if they have the COA, they're free to go, or they can submit a revision. So they do not have approval to revise their scope outside of what that COA permits them to do. If it's denied, the applicant does have some recourse, and this is also sometimes discussed at hearings. They can revise the application at any time, as long as it's, I mean, it doesn't have to be consistent, but revised application can be submitted at any time and just follow the normal application process. They cannot come back with the same application for a 1-year period. This is definitely a shortfall in the code because it's really, the language is intended to follow kind of the rezoning process. And so you can imagine if you were requesting a specific zoning type, it was denied, you can't keep asking that question. Mm-hmm. The problem is HDRC is more complicated. There's more nuance in the applications. If it's, again, something with an architectural set, you can change anything in that architectural set and it could be a change. And so there's really not currently a defined threshold for what is needed in order to be reconsidered within a 1-year period. And that's something we're going to look at in the code updates. But again, it can't be identical, but we have had several applications that were denied that did change an element, and it's not always a positive change or a negative change, but if it's different, they are eligible to come back. The only difference is if it's been to the BOA, so if they've appealed the denial and were denied again, or we've had a case where it was approved and then appealed and then not denied by the BOA, the code is clear that following disapproval by the BOA, the HDRC then has discretion on whether to accept a subsequent application. This is unique to the BOA process, and the threshold for meeting the requirements to be reconsidered is not clearly defined as well. And so my next slide here is about appeals, but let's talk about this. I said we weren't going to speak much about UDC amendments in these sessions, but this is something that we want to better define in the future, is when can a denied project return? How must it be revised in order to return? How many times they can attempt to do this? And I think the main issue is defining what a change is. And so changes could be positive or negative. And so we want to make sure that anything that's changed is going to be based on either the guidelines or previous stipulations or previous recommendations of the commission, if anything. So that the application must be moving in the right direction in order to be reconsidered by the HDRC. And then, of course, all of this is designed to encourage applicants to keep working with the HDRC instead of going to the BOA. If you go to the BOA, if you appeal your denial or appeal a stipulation that you don't agree with, we are very upfront with people that this isn't always a great option. It's not cheap to do. Somebody jump in here. I think it's $600. It might be $700. $600. The results are not guaranteed. And the HDRC's had a pretty strong track record the past year. I don't think we've had any cases this past year that were overturned by the BOA. So after a long process for those applicants, they are in the same position that they started in. The BOA's role is also not to reconsider the request of that the HDRC saw. Their role is really to consider the process and if the HDRC was correct in its interpretation of the code. And so a lot of times people view the BOA as sort of a second stab at their application, but it's really not. It's really supposed to be a review of whether or not the HDRC followed the process correctly, and generally they do. We try to encourage consistency at the HDRC because they're the authority, they're the experts on historic properties, and the BOA just isn't. And so we want to keep things in that HDRC arena versus sending it to another commission when possible. You will see at hearings, our commissioners sometimes get fatigued and like they've got a case that they just can't agree on. It's heading towards a denial. And so they will sometimes ask us to speak to what could happen next. A lot of times they're tempted, I think, to punch the BOA if they can't really get to a resolution on a case. And we do encourage them at their training, try to keep it at the HDRC, try to negotiate amongst yourselves or with the applicant to get to a place where you're maintaining control over the application. Because if you just deny it, if you just deny a bad application and they appeal it and get that approved, then you've lost your authority over the project. And so we really try to remind the HDRC that is sort of their review authority. Questions about appeals and subsequent applications. I think there's some in the chat. What is the substantial change question? This is relating to what you think it is. There's a section code that speaks to this part specifically. Sorry. Where? I'm sorry, I lost the slide that I was on. It's this last bullet. The part about the HDRC only having the discretion to accept a subsequent application following disapproval by the BOA. That is unique to one small section of code, and there's not a lot of guidance there. And so yes, that is the question: is Can that be expanded? Should it include language that, isn't just the BOA process? What if the HDRC denies an application and you want to come back? What should that returning application look like? We just don't have a lot right now. And so that is something that we're looking at. Barbara says 112 Lindell started 20 years ago. Wouldn't be as successful of a project if River Road hadn't been a historic district negotiations, which took court cases and many design review field trips by commissioners. Bye, Scott. Scott's leaving us. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes a case is appealed. So let's talk about appeals. The state law was updated 2 years ago at the 2019 session to make it a little bit more difficult. The issue is that sometimes these appeals were made by third parties and sometimes they were frivolous. And so the current rule is that there's a shorter amount of time that somebody can appeal. It's 20 days. It used to be 30 days. And you have to be, it used to be any aggrieved party. So anybody who disagreed with the decision could appeal it to the BOA. And now it is specific to a property owner within a certain radius of the property. I think it's 250 feet or 200 feet. And so you have to be another owner in proximity to that property. And so that does make it more difficult to submit an appeal if you were an aggrieved party. But otherwise, anyone can submit it if you disagree with an action, or the applicant who was denied can also appeal. So there's kind of two ways that an appeal can be made. Depending on the outcome at BOA, again, the BOA is quasi-judicial, so they're sort of the final recommending body of the city, then that can enter the court system. And so appeals of the BOA are made to district court, and then so on. There's additional appellate courts that would follow if it kept going. And I believe Lindell did go 4 steps deep, I think. But again, yes, it's, the BOA could approve an appeal, and then that decision to approve an appeal could then be sent to district court, where it could be reversed to the original commission decision. So that has happened in the past, but it's not at all common. What is the role of the city attorney rep that sits on the HDRC and BOA hearings? Often they seem to be silent, and they should be advising on law and proper procedure. Yeah, I mean, generally, if they're there as the commission's attorney. So if there is a legal question or a procedural question by the commission, then they are there as support. They are also there to keep us in line. So if we do forget to do something, or if we are, maybe we've lost quorum and didn't realize it, they will interrupt to make sure that we are remaining legal for the meeting.
Corey, how often is the city attorney who's sitting there overturned? I've seen that a couple of times. They make a statement and a stand, and then later on that's overturned by powers to be above them.
The question is how often?
I mean, is that quite frequent, or is it just very rare?
No, I mean, and obviously you've seen, like, if something requires some thought, like, and it's not just like an easy answer, then we will take time or we'll recess. Sometimes those can be even executive sessions. We don't do executive sessions a whole lot, but yeah, that is an option. Especially when it comes to, I can think of the last one where we really had to pause. Like, we were looking very closely at that 60-day timeline, the number of times that the applicant had requested postponement, what the code language was, and whether or not an HDRC decision needed to be forced because of that timeline. And that took some time to really sit down. We had calculators and we were adding up the days to make sure that we were in compliance with the code. So yeah, sometimes there's the ability to pause and discuss the interpretation internally with staff. Yes, they're an assistant city attorney. And so all of the boards and commissions do have a designated assistant city attorney. Ours is Alma Lozano. She's at all of the hearings. Okay, I think we hit all the questions for this section. So let's get into participation. It is 10 o'clock, so we've got about 30 minutes left, and I think we can do it. We had a meeting with this group in the summer, last summer of 2020, discussing a little bit about these changes and how it was going. So we are currently, when COVID started, the Texas Attorney General issued guidance for how public meetings would continue in order to comply with the Texas Open Meetings Act. And so it's basically like an amended Open Meetings Act currently that we're operating under. It has not been revised since April, I think is when those changes came out. And until those changes are rescinded by the Attorney General, there's no reason to stop conducting virtual meetings or to change what we're doing. So the participation methods have changed a little bit. What we were grappling with is the ability of somebody previously to walk into a meeting, write their name down, and then have their time to speak. And if they needed a translator, that translator would be standing right there, and we could all do it in person pretty quickly. And then as they sign in, we would just have the physical list right there, and we would be able to call people. Now that people are signing up virtually to speak, it's a little trickier. There's a few issues. One, it takes more time to kind of prepare everything for the commissioners, since we're now accepting multiple forms of participation, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. But two is we needed to preserve time to translate comments if it's needed. And so we currently require that all public comments are received at 9 a.m. the day of the hearing. Prior to that, it could be, you could leave comments at the hearing. Like you could walk up and sign as long as the case hasn't been discussed yet. How to listen? I showed this at the summer meeting, but let's go ahead and pull it up. Make sure I'm showing. Share my browser. The Development Services Department website is where you go for recording meetings. It's actually this tile right here. When you load the page first, you have to navigate to it. This is a little rotating banner, but this is the easiest link to get to. If there's a meeting taking place, it'll automatically be streaming. So if it's time for HDRC, just go to that site and you should be able to find it. Now, what's great about this feature is that it archives all of the meetings. They're translated to Spanish, and so there's a version of every meeting that is translated and has the dubbed voiceover so that you have that. And then you click one of these, all of the cases are indexed, which is great. We used to have to listen to a 3-hour or fast forward through a 3-hour video to find the case we're looking for. Now you can just click on it and it'll automatically take you to that discussion. So that should make it a little easier if you're looking for a specific outcome to find that case. If you're really just looking for the motion, the easiest thing to do is click on the case after it, then rewind a little bit, just a couple minutes, and you should get there. Let me go back to my slides. Okay, does everyone see slides? Mm-hmm. Okay. And again, as I mentioned, we'll keep doing this until there's a revised order from the Attorney General. So the method we came up with, and we collaborated with DSD, because they manage the other larger boards and commissions, Zoning Commission, BOA, Planning Commission, and we all have the most business. And so we were the first commissions to go live with the virtual hearing process. And because we had cases piling up. So we had our first one on May 1st, and we've had completely virtual hearings ever since. The process we came up with internally and then with the city attorney's office is that comments can be sent in for staff to read, and as determined by the chairs, it's a 2-minute speaking time. And so we've created a form that has a character limit that's about 2 minutes. If I read really slow, I tend to read fast, and so sometimes it's quicker than 2 minutes. But that's about the right amount for comments to be read. Not everybody wants to do that. We also have the ability for somebody to leave a voicemail, leave their 2 minutes of comments by voicemail that we can play at the hearing, and many of you have done that. I personally think that is the best option. And it's something that we might continue doing following return to in-person meetings. I think it's a convenience factor for a lot of people. Because we're just like on a video conference like this, it's pretty easy to call people and connect them to the meeting. And so you can request to be called during the hearing and provide live comments. Not many people do this, surprisingly. I think just because it's more convenient to either leave the written comments or to leave a voicemail. But again, if you are called and there's questions from the commissioners regarding your comments, you have the ability to have some discourse with them. All of the written comments, and so we still receive things by email. Sometimes they're like a scanned PDF letter that's been signed by somebody. It's not our policy to read those right now, just because using the form, we know it's a fair character limit and everybody is doing the same thing. If you're sending an email, it may not be the same length as everybody else's, and so it's just not fair. And so what we're doing is providing copies of all of those to commissioners, and they do access them. You will see them very often at the hearings citing something in a letter that they've received. And so all the cases are, we'll have a file for all the cases to have all the letters and comments provided for them. So there was a question earlier in the chat about this, and I said we'd get to it. Now I forgot what the question is. Who asked it? Was it a question from Barbara? It looks like it might have been. Let me go back up and see. Or maybe we talked about it. Maybe it was the thing about designating a representative for your group. Monica asks, who is community and neighborhood to OHP and HDRC? That's an easy answer for me. It's everybody. I think there's a lot of times a misconception that the official registered neighborhood association gets more of a weigh-in than other people. And, you know, that perception exists because maybe it is true in some places, but I do feel where there's comments submitted by people at the HDRC, the commissioners are very sensitive to them, regardless of if it has a logo on the letterhead or not. Gemma?
Corey, so if you want to send in certain photographs or graphs to be attached to your comments, say our voice comments, how do we do that? Is there a way to do that?
That's a good question. Some people have done that. We have to toe the line a little bit because it's also our policy not to show a lot of exhibits outside of what was posted publicly. But sometimes there are just like photographs or things that are not really related to the design that we can include if they give some context to the comments. And so what will happen is those people will usually just email us and they'll say either, actually on the Google form, if you leave comments on the Google form, there's a place to attach. And so we can receive them that way. But usually what happens is somebody has left a voicemail recording and they send us attachments they want on the screen while the recording is being played. And so that's what we've done is if we receive something that is not, like we got something one time that was the applicant's exhibits but modified, and we don't want to do that too much because it's confusing and then they're looking at something that's different than what was posted. But if it's photographs or like a annotated site plan, something with just like information or context to the statements, and that's something we can easily display on the screen.
Thanks.
Okay. I think that's a really good question, Gemma, and because especially in River Road, if you look at a map of River Road and you look at the historic district and you look at the river and the park and everything around it, that might take the place of the commissioner site visit. I hadn't thought about that.
Let me get to the second part of Monica's statement here. Sometimes a neighborhood association, well, it's fine. I'm the one looking at it. Sometimes a neighborhood association's comments have been given more weight over a higher number of neighbor comments who may have higher stake, like proximity to the project. Monica, that's your comment. Do you want to speak to that? I honestly, I don't fully agree. I feel like there's been plenty of instances where like the neighboring property has, held court with the commission because they do care what they have to say about the project.
I don't have a specific or two or three specific examples right here, and I know time is of the essence, but I do think because of the new video hearings and the ability for individuals to participate, it has increased the participation of lots of neighbors and lots of neighborhood associations. On the other hand, some of them have dropped out and are not participating. And they're participating in a skeleton form, and they're not participating with the neighborhood membership. So, no, there are probably two or three cases I can come up with where we find that an NA's letter opposed something, and the majority of other comments were opposite. And so it's not it doesn't happen all the time, but unfortunately, because Dignowity Hill is a very, very active area, we've probably seen more. I can probably find those for you, but this is not a good time for it because of your presentation.
It is true. Like, organizations do bear a little more weight, right? And I do find that neighboring property owners probably carry more weight than that. So if we get a random letter from somebody that doesn't even live in the neighborhood, which sometimes happens, and sometimes those are somewhat dismissed unless there's something really relevant. Like I would totally agree with that. But in my experience with our current commission, I don't think that being the registered association always is the end all. I do think they listen to all the comments.
Well, at the last one of the last hearings or more recent hearings, one of the commissioners just did make a point, a very determined or intentional point, that the neighborhood association had included a letter that was counter to even, I believe, staff's comments. And
they probably, but they probably agreed with it, is what they were saying. I mean, we're not always going to agree, and so that doesn't mean that somebody is listening more to one person than not. They just agree with that person.
Sure. Well, it's common knowledge that we have issues with the different contingencies in our neighborhood, and it's just lots of voices to consider. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, totally agree. Any other questions? So I have two things from this session that I am going to pencil in for the 5th session, the add-on. So we're going to talk more about DRC. We've had in our the UDC task force conversations from now at this point, almost 2 years ago, summer of 2019. This is something we talked about specifically, and kind of which direction those need to go in, if they need to be more formalized or less formalized. So let's talk about that. And then distinguishing between NCDs and historic districts. And that, if there's time, that's possibly something we can talk about in the designation session, but I think we'll just add it to last. Can we have a more in-depth discussion regarding historic districts and commissioner communication? Yes.
Because I don't want to break the law without knowing what I'm getting into.
You're not breaking the law. I think we can all agree it is best, though, if that discourse happens where everybody can see it. So yeah, we always tell our commissioners, if somebody stops you in the grocery store, like, you don't have to hide from them, you don't have to ignore them. But at some point, if you're not comfortable with what's being discussed, then you can tell them, like, this might impact my ability to take action on this. Like, I might feel like I need to recuse based on this conversation. So very often they opt not to. Okay, but yeah, we'll touch on that more. And we'll probably, I might ask Alma as she's our assistant
Yeah,
superintendent, right? So she could probably weigh in on that as well. Yeah, Joe says if he's asked to speak to a commission before and they've asked that OHP staff be present, like it's what they're comfortable with. And so if they want a witness, then we can sometimes fill that role. That doesn't happen a whole lot, but that's mostly what they're getting at is, if they can have a comfort level with the discussion, then that's fine. If it reaches a point where they're not comfortable, then they may have to recuse on that case when it's heard. Okay, well, thank you all. This recording will be available sometime, probably next week on that same link. Let me know in the meantime if you think of anything else, any other questions or topics to add to that last session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say thank you for fixing your Explorer map comments in the PDF?
Oh yeah, I should have said that. Yeah.
Yes.
I think what happened is there was a security update at some point that interrupted that flow, and so where the files are is secure and protected and firewalled, and there's a path to get to that PDF, and somewhere that path got interrupted. So it's actually a whole new application that's producing those PDFs now. And you should be able to do that. I did it on my phone, which I think is the best option for a lot of people. So yeah, I think we actually made an improvement from that.
It's very handy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good job.